Chapter 17. Our last formal orientation for experience points was in the sparring room, and at Dr. Roop's advice, we all dressed appropriately. I had on basketball shorts, an old t-shirt, and Chuck Taylors. Mi-sun wore her white martial arts uniform with, of course, a black belt. Charles wore a polo shirt and cotton shorts, both with the insignia from his private school back home, and Nyana wore a pink tracksuit, and she looked only marginally more comfortable about all this than I did. The sparring room was on the same basement level as the spaceflight sim suites. It also looked a whole lot like a martial arts sparring room on Earth, with padded walls and floors. It also had an attached control room from which you could watch the proceedings. But you couldn't see the control room from the sparring room. I guess so that people who were fighting wouldn't be self-conscious about audience reactions. From inside the control room, Dr. Roop showed us how to work the console.
You can either spar with another being,
he said,
or the computer can use plasma-based field technology to create an artificial partner based on your specific level of fitness. The computer will also generate a protective field, which you can set anywhere from a maximum of level 10, which makes it more or less impossible to get hurt, to level 1, in which you can get hurt and serious injury, while unlikely, does remain possible. Some beings do need the threat of real consequence to be at their best. Now, who would like to go first?
Could I volunteer not to go at all? I asked. His eyes widened.
I would like everybody to sample the process. If it's not your strongest area, you need not pursue excellence in this field, but you'll never know until you try.
I'll go, Mi-sun said. Good girl, Mrs. Price said, looking up from her endless note-taking. Mi-sun rewarded Mrs. Price's enthusiasm by rolling her eyes. Dr. Roop showed her how to program an artificial opponent, and she selected one that the computer gauged as being slightly superior to her. For protection, she selected level 8. I need to feel something when I'm hit, she said, but I don't need to feel too much. I'd never seen Mi-sun fight before, and I had to admit I was impressed. Most of what I knew about martial arts came from Hong Kong movies, so I'd never really seen Taekwondo in action, but it was almost as much of a dance as a fight. Mi-sun would begin with these exaggerated postures, with her legs wide, her arms fixed, and each blow she struck or blocked looked like a choreographed movement, but she was quick and graceful and powerful, and I knew the sense of scripting was just an illusion produced by her skill. I didn't much like Mi-sun, but I sure respected her. Her artificial opponent, which looked like a rectangular-headed mannequin made of blue light, was supposed to be a little bit better than she was, but it was quickly outclassed. Mi-sun lashed out with a seemingly endless stream of wide kicks. It got in a couple of glancing blows, which caused a blue shimmer of light around Mi-sun as the force field kicked in, but the opponent was defeated in less than 90 seconds. As Mi-sun emerged from the fighting room, Mrs. Price looked up, flashed her most convincing artificial smile, and went back to her notes. Ardov volunteered to go next. Like the other Rarls, he wore a loose-fitting sleeveless robe thing that was tightly cinched at the waist and flared out to skirts around his knees. On Temret, it looked great. On Ardov, it looked stupid. Actually, it looked kind of intimidating, but I told myself it looked stupid because that made me feel better. I liked Ardov even less than Mi-sun, maybe less than anyone, anywhere, and I wanted to see him fail miserably. He was good, however. Fast, strong, and unpredictable. His opponent was the same sort of rectangular-headed mannequin, and it was supposed to be 25% more skillful than Ardov, but he defeated it in under a minute with a series of kicks, elbow jabs, and sideways punches. Steve went next, and that was also something wholly unexpected. Ishii apparently didn't dress much differently for exercise than they did for everything else. He wore what appeared to be his usual tunic. He did remove his sandals, however, and then bounded into the sparring room, looking every bit the predator I'd thought him to be the first time I'd seen him in my room. He and his artificial opponent were almost too fast to watch, as he raced across the floors and up the walls. They lashed out with arms and legs, and in Steve's case, his tail. Minus the web shooters, Steve had the Spider-Man skill set, but so did his opponent, and though he put up a serious fight, Steve lost after about 10 minutes. He came out breathing hard and grinning his reptilian grin.
That was right fun, he said. I'm doing this every bloody day.
I figured that I should get it over with, and it was better to go after Steve, who'd make any human appear lame by comparison. I chose an opponent at my level and maximum force field and stepped into the fighting room, which smelled of rubber and alien sweat. Later, Dr. Roop told me I could watch my replay of the fight, but I sincerely hope I never have to see what happened in there. My artificial opponent and I faced off in a fighting style known as Spastic Playground Rumble. He took a swing at me, and I took a swing at him. We were both good at avoiding getting hit. In fact, I was a little better than I thought I should be. It had to be the skill points I'd been putting into agility. After we'd been fighting for about 5 minutes, I was starting to get tired. Most playground fights I'd seen ended pretty quickly, and 5 minutes of continuous swinging, dodging, and moving around turned out to be exhausting work. Finally, I decided to let my opponent hit me. I wasn't planning on taking a dive, but I wanted to know what getting hit would feel like. That way, I could measure how close I was willing to move in. It seemed like a smart idea at the time. My opponent took a swing, and it connected with my jaw. I didn't feel any pain. The plasma field protected me from the worst of the punch, but I was suddenly on my back, looking up, and my HUD told me I'd lost the match. When I went back to the control room, I saw Mi-sun trying not to laugh. Ardov was standing next to Tamret, whispering in her ear. She looked at me and smiled sympathetically, as if to say it was all right with her if I was the worst fighter in the galaxy. That didn't really make me feel any better, though. When I stood next to Steve, he looked at me and cocked his head a little.
You know, you're more the distance guy. I'm for close-up.
Yeah, but your shit beat mine yesterday, I said glumly.
Good point, mate.
He agreed. After we had each taken a turn sparring with an artificial opponent, Ardov asked about sparring with real opponents. I'd like to see how that works.
That's probably a good idea,
Dr. Roop said.
Are there any volunteers?
Ardov pointed at me. He flashed what I was sure he thought was an affable smile, but he just looked evil to me. Let's go, monkey boy. No thanks, I said, holding up my hands, trying to act like it was no big deal. There are shields to keep you from getting too hurt, he said. Unless you're too much of a coward. Everybody already knows you're a better fighter than I am, I said, feeling my face get hot. Well, then I'll teach you a few things. You'll thank me later. Mrs. Price stopped typing and glared at me.
You're making our species look bad. Get in there and fight him.
I felt everything closing in on me. I was, to be honest, terrified at the idea of fighting Ardov, who I was sure had some trick in mind for making sure I got hurt in spite of the plasma fields. The best case scenario was that he absolutely humiliated me without actually putting me in the hospital. On the other hand, if I didn't fight him, I'd look pathetic, and I'd never live it down. I hated the idea of him smacking me around, but I realized that I didn't hate it as much as having the other humans and Tamret see that I was too afraid to face him. I told myself that even if he managed to hurt me in spite of the safety measures, the Confederation's medical technology would make sure nothing serious happened. There was nothing to do but accept the challenge. I opened my mouth to speak, but hesitated just an instant. Tamret was staring at me, her expression pointed like she was trying to tell me something. I knew she didn't want me to fight, and I knew she could see that I had no choice. I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, though. Fear. I'll fight him, Mi-sun said, with the enthusiasm of someone who just agreed to empty the dishwasher. Ardov looked at me. If the monkey boy's too afraid, then why not? You didn't seem too helpless. I felt relief and fear in equal measures, and I kept my eyes down, not wanting to look at anybody, knowing I'd see pity on their faces. I couldn't help myself, though. I glanced up at Tamret, and she was looking right at me. But I didn't see pity. I saw relief. Mi-sun and Ardov agreed to fight with the force field turned down to level 2. Dr. Roop advised against it, but it became clear that he wouldn't force them to do anything his way. And Ardov insisted. Mi-sun merely shrugged, like it didn't matter to her one way or the other. They squared off, Ardov adopting a position with open hands, arms at shoulder length, bent at 90 degrees. He had one leg in front of the other. Mi-sun stood with her legs wide apart, her knees slightly bent, and her fists balled, her arms close to her body. And then they began. Mi-sun didn't waste any time. She launched a spinning kick to Ardov's face, and it hit him with a sharp thud. Blue plasma flashed as Ardov went reeling back. You see face kicks all the time in comic books and sometimes in kung fu movies, but in real life it's easier to see how much space the foot has to travel. but Mi-sun was fast and accurate and powerful.
Yes,
I said. I felt the eyes of all the other Rorals on me, including Tamret, so I decided I'd keep my opinions to myself from now on. Ardov wiped his face with the back of his hand. There was a small amount of blood dripping from his nose. He stepped in towards Mi-sun, crouched, and leapt at her. He hadn't leapt like that in his own match, and Mi-sun was caught off guard. He passed her in the air, and she lunged backwards, but he reached out and managed to strike her across the face with his forearm. She went down, her own nose bloody. Without the force field, that blow might have crushed her face.
I believe I've seen enough,
Dr. Rube said. He signaled the two fighters via their data bracelets.
You've both done well. Let's end this before somebody gets hurt.
Aw, come on, it's just getting fun, Ardov said. I'm fine. Mi-sun's voice was troublingly distant. She was in some kind of zone, and I thought nothing anyone said was going to pull her out of it. Ardov lashed out with another one of his flying arm sweeps, but this time Mi-sun was ready. She ducked under it and kicked Ardov in the back. He went face first into one of the wall mats. Mi-sun wasn't about to wait for him to regain his balance. She'd had a taste of his power and didn't want to let him get the upper hand again. As soon as he bounced off the wall, she landed another kick to Ardov's face. He tried to move out of the way, but her bare foot still clipped his chin. She then launched into a series of quick jabs to his midsection. He stood in her wide stance and lashed 6 times in a row. Ardov was caught in the whirlwind of her assault and couldn't make his body respond. He had to take it, and his face contorted with pain, rage, and frustration. I thought Mi-sun had him, and I was breathlessly excited. I was ready to buy her a victory pizza. But then Ardov somehow broke out of her hold, shoving her back so hard she stumbled and fell to the mats. Without stopping to catch his breath, he crouched and leapt like no human could, striking her as she tried to rise, with an open hand under her jaw, sending her reeling back. The force field sparked like a blue explosion. Mi-sun crab-walked back and leapt to her feet, quick and agile, as though the blow hadn't fazed her at all. But when she opened her mouth, I could see that her teeth were covered in blood. "Make them stop," I said. "She's really not getting enough protection." Dr. Roop was already signaling them, before I began to speak.
That's enough, he said. I want both of you to end this.
"Not yet," Ardov said. Mi-sun shook her head, stubbornly refusing to quit, but she didn't look right to me. Her eyes lacked focus, and her balance was off. Even Mrs. Price, who'd stopped typing for once, looked on with concern. "Why don't you just raise the force field level?" I asked.
I can't tamper with the system once the match has begun, Dr. Roop said. The only thing I can do is cancel the program entirely, but if they don't stop when I do that, they'll be fighting with no protection at all. Right, said Steve. I'll go in there and make a convincing case for ending the match.
Steve had only taken a couple of steps towards the door when Ardov spun around and kicked Mi-sun hard in the back. His foot struck hard and flat, and Mi-sun flew into the wall, face first, connecting with a sickening slap. I thought the padding would be enough to protect her, and after she struck, she remained standing for a beat. Then she fell to the floor. Mi-sun's jaw was slack, her eyes fluttered momentarily, and then closed. Ardov stood with his back to us, his head down, breathing heavily. Then he turned to face the control room, his mouth open in a sickly grin. "I win,"